I'm Matt Brownell.
And I'm Van Owens.
And I'm Tim Adams.
Welcome to Climbing the Mountain, where we dive into the scriptures and discuss themes, connections, and real-life application. We're kicking off a series here where we're going to examine the Sermon on the Mount and discuss implications for this teaching for Christians today. Welcome back. We are closing out Matthew 7. We are in the Sermon on the Mount, and we have gotten past the Golden Rule and are focused. Last time we talked about entering through the narrow gate and what that meant and how there's two paths in life. And we're going to pick up there again and then move into the next few verses about false prophets and a tree and its fruit. Van, would you like to read those scriptures?
Absolutely. Matthew 7, starting in verse 13, it says, "Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate, and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate, and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. Watch out for false prophets that come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. By their fruit you will recognize them. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus, by their fruit, you will recognize them."
Excellent. Great. So Jesus calls, now I'm going to borrow terminology from Psalm 1, the way of the wicked, the easy or broad path, the one everyone is taking. However, we see in Proverbs 13:15 that this way is treacherous, rugged, or an enduring rut. I think it's hard to translate that verse, but I think that's what it might be saying. So my question is, how can the broad path be easy and hard?
So I'd like to kind of throw somewhat of a wrench, because that's what I do. And I actually, I totally get what you're saying, and I will answer the question. But I also don't think Jesus is saying that the people on the broad road here are wicked or evil. I don't actually see that in the text in Matthew. It seems like it's just easier to find and it's easier to be on. And it's sort of the default option. And it doesn't say the people are evil. It doesn't say the people are anything. It just is easier there. And so it's
the
kind
way
of...
of the wicked has such good alliteration, though, Jim.
It does. Now that is fair. It does have the alliteration going for it. I think it's more that this like broad road is where we just end up by default if we're not paying attention. It's where we tend to go, and it's just where we go if we don't have the tools and the ability and the intention to get on the narrow road. I think one example I'll have with this is I have two young kids, and I think that almost universally every parent in the world is doing their best. Now, if you really want to nitpick me and talk about the like truly awful parents, then you can go have that conversation with yourself. But because I don't really want to have that. But for the most part, and the people I interact with, every parent is doing their best. And I don't consider myself really all that good of a parent, but I've been given a lot of tools to address things in my kids' lives. And just because we're Christians doesn't mean my friends who aren't Christians that my kids are any better than them or any better behaved than them or have better attitudes than them. It just means that I have been given the tools to address the issues in my kids' lives, whereas I'll see friends who will just kind of go, what are we going to do? And I think like they're not evil because they don't have the tools. They don't love their kids any less because they don't have the tools. They just haven't been given the tools. And so I don't think Jesus is calling these people evil. He's saying you got to actually try to find it. Now, in terms of how can it be like easy and hard, it's easier to find. So you just kind of tend to go there. I mean, it's the easy to find, but it's harder to walk. It has a lot more hardship. It might seem smoother, but you just don't have tools to handle life on the broad road. The narrow road is where you can get the tools to handle it.
So I think I'm going to throw a wrench at your wrench.
Do I get to throw the wrench back?
Yeah.
All right.
If you can dodge a ball, you can dodge a wrench.
If you can dodge a ball, you can dodge a wrench. Does that testify to how big nerds we are, that we all know the same reference, or how old we are?
That one flies over my head.
If it was a Star Wars reference, I would have been out, because I don't know.
So when you say, I don't think that Jesus is calling them evil, I'm with you on that, except just a couple of verses later, he says, away from me, you evildoers. Which, to me, when I get to that passage, I'm always, wow, how did they go from being, sort of wandering down the broad road, and we're going down the road in the sermon, and suddenly they're evildoers? So I think that there is some room to say that he might be talking about evil and good. And I think that when I think about this, when I think about how can the broad road be both hard and easy, I think of the sort of the dual nature of humans, right? So we're physical beings. We have flesh and we have spirit. And I think that the broad road is easy for our flesh, because it's broad and because it requires no effort to find it. He says that many take the broad road, but few find the narrow road. So taking a road because it's there and looking for a road that you don't necessarily see, it requires some effort. And I think the broad road is easy for our flesh. It's difficult for our spirits, for our hearts, for our minds. That's where you get into the ruts. That's where you have the consequences of living a life that is not in accordance with the will of God. Those consequences attack you during your life, and they attack you from within. They breed insecurity. They breed animosity. They breed all these things that trouble our souls, not necessarily our flesh right away.
Yeah.
And in the same token, the narrow road is, in that sense, easy on our souls, but hard on our flesh, because we have to deny some of the desires that come up with us as we look for that narrow road, and and both of them affect the other. So the broad road affects the soul, even though it's comfortable to the flesh. The narrow road affects the body, even though it's comfortable for the soul. That really we're creatures of a dual nature, but those two things work together. And so I think that it is easy and hard. Both roads are easy and hard.
Yeah.
Can I answer the wrench Van threw into my argument?
Sure.
So I absolutely agree with you. He's calling the people evildoers, but I think he's also calling a specific group of people evildoers. He's talking about I think he's talking about the people who are trying, get more into this, who are like presuming they're good and doing the things but missing what's important. I won't get too much more into that. I don't think he's calling everybody who just kind of takes the default road evil or ill-intentioned or wicked.
That's interesting. We'll get into that more later, because I think there's some more things to tease out of that. Because Tim, did you have any thoughts about this? Because
nothing that's significant enough to add.
I guess for me, this seemed like a little like the frog being boiled. You're in the pot and, hey, it's nice swimming around in here. And, oh, it feels so relaxing now, so warm. And then eventually you don't realize you're getting cooked until it's too late. You can't move and hop out. And I think that when I was thinking about this, I think it's sort of like that. Everyone's on the broad path, and I think on the broad path we look for stuff to provide meaning for us, for our lives. Like we run after, and they're idols basically. Anything that we don't run after God first is an idol. It's like I think of work or money or family, fame, sex, partying, whatever it is. If it becomes an idol, and it could be a good thing, totally fine. But if it becomes an idol, like the most important thing, it will become a slave master and it will destroy us. And the thing that we put before God, let's say it's work. Well, if work is our master, we're going to maybe burn ourselves out. We're going to try to justify ourselves by what we do and try to get recognition that way or get affirmation from people around us. But, what if our boss ignores us? What if we don't get recognition? Well, it's going to destroy us. That'll be overwhelming for us. And I think that's like we talked about appetizers in the last podcast, appetizers of heaven. In the church, and this is like an appetizer of hell, basically. Mm.
So I have the next question here. Up to this point, the sermon's been primarily, perhaps exclusively, concerned with the behavior of the listeners, the people who are following Jesus. Why now does Jesus introduce these new quote-unquote prophets? What dangers do they pose to the people? In verse 16, Jesus calls us to look at their fruit. What is the fruit that these false prophets produce?
Yeah, Jesus paints two really graphic images here, I think. One of false prophets as wolves in sheep's clothing, and another of a tree and its fruit. And with the first, I think it's hard not to think of Ezekiel 34. That's what I thought of right away when, God's condemnation of the shepherds that devour their flock. And I think given that reference point, what I think Jesus is doing is calling out our spiritual leaders. Mm-hmm. And I think Matthew's about to draw a distinction between Jesus and the religious leaders of the day at the end of the sermon. Jesus has actual authority, but we have to be careful, I think, about who we let into our lives. Leaders have influence. And so, incidentally, I think that's why the Bereans were noted as having noble character in Acts 17. They went back to the scriptures to see if Paul's words were true. Mm-hmm. And a false prophet doesn't say what God says. He distorts, neglects, twists, or outright fabricates lies. Mm-hmm. But it's not just what our leaders say that we must weigh here. We see that we must examine their lives. And I think the other thing it reminds me of is when Paul tells Timothy and Titus to ensure that elders and deacons are serving. He gives them metrics to judge various people's fitness to serve. He tells them to do the same thing Jesus tells us here: examine their fruit. Do their children respect God? Do they know the proper use of money? Are they given to wild debauchery? Are they polygamists? There's a deep connection with what someone believes and says and how they live their life. In Jesus' example, the thorn bush, it doesn't have the right DNA or doctrinal DNA, we'll say, to produce grapes. But if a tree is diseased, that's another thing. If a leader is relying on himself instead of Jesus, it's not going to produce good fruit either. So I think, I don't know, God is going to hold leaders accountable. So I think it's really important we pray for them, but I think we also have to, examine things, keep our eyes open. Mm-hmm.
So I think Matt started pulling a great thread, and again, we could do a whole nother podcast on this particular thread of the leadership and the influence, and that. I think the thing I saw here that I honestly missed for most of my Christian life until I stopped. I've started to question my baseline Christian interpretation of things, which has been really helpful, and that's that we define false prophet almost exclusively by what comes out of a person's mouth, by what they say. That's sort of how the Christian world defines false prophet. Like, do you say the right thing? Do you, or not? Like, if you say what's accurate, you're a true prophet. If you say what's inaccurate, you're a false prophet. And I think what's interesting in this section is Jesus doesn't say anything about the person's teaching. There's not a word about what the false prophet says, it's all about what their fruit is. It's all about what their life produces. And when I think of fruit, I think of a natural consequence of living. You either produce something good or you produce something bad. And what Jesus is telling here, and Matt alluded to it with the religious leaders of the day, is that the fruit of what the Sadducees, who were kind of the in charge people, were producing was division, was Roman occupation, it was corruption. They were horrifically corrupt. That was their fruit. That's what they had produced. And what, on a more individual level, Jesus is telling us that, look at what people's lives produce. They can say everything perfectly. Like if they actually say everything right, but their lives don't produce the things that God wants, then they're false prophets. It doesn't matter if they get their doctrine perfect. It's what their life produces. And I think that's a really hard thing for us because we want to say, oh, I got my doctrine accurate, so like overlook the little things in my life in lives. And I'm not saying there isn't grace. I'm not saying, we can't be forgiving. I'm not saying that. But I think we would love to be able to overlook a lot of things in a way that Jesus is telling, no, I don't. I'm more concerned with how you live and how you treat people and how you actually walk out what I'm saying. That was a big thing when he said abolish or fulfill. You could have perfect doctrine and you can still abolish Torah by not walking it out well. And he's saying a real prophet walks this out well.
Yeah, when you're talking about that, Jim, I'm thinking about, I don't know where it is in the Gospels, but Jesus says, you should listen to those who sit in Moses' seat, but be careful not to do what they do, right?
Right.
And there's a mismatch there. They had great doctrine, they weren't living it out. And yeah, there's so many things about false prophets that we see that over and over and over again in the Old Testament of the true prophets hammering those who were called to shepherd the flock, and they were just lying. They were calling good evil and evil good, or maybe they were fasting, but it wasn't true fasting because they're oppressing people at the same time. All these different examples. So I think that's an awesome point. I think the other, one of the things that I was thinking about from this is because we can be so focused on doctrine, right? We can kind of get caught up in these, I don't know, we get caught up in the air, right? We get caught up in, and Paul warns Timothy about that in 1 Timothy. He's like, watch out for the people who devote themselves to endless genealogies and to myths and to all this stuff. And they're forgetting the gospel. They're forgetting, which is tied to how they're living and what they're doing. And that Irenaeus brings up a point similar to that. But to me, it's basically paraphrasing it. It's let's not get so caught up in the what ifs or the mysteries and whatever that might be that we forget the things that are really obvious and that are the bedrock of walking with God, right? And that's what we'll see from if there is a true prophet, we'll see that they cling to the word, right? The capital W word, Jesus, and the life that he lived, and everything else will flow out of that.
Yeah. I was reminded of something I heard someone say once, and that's that there are people who have their doctrine perfectly correct, who, and we probably have met a few of them, who you see their lives and you go, oh man, that guy's life is a mess, or that her life is a mess, or gee, that family is a mess. Now, all our families are messes, but I'm not talking about standard mess. I'm talking about real mess. And then we have other people who don't claim to be Christian. They're not trying, but they have love, they have kindness, they have compassion, literally flowing out of their pores. And it's hard to reconcile those things. But unless we can say, God created that person to be this and show us, and we can call that good, right? Like, I know people in town who are great guys. They're not Christians. Hopefully they will be, but like, God made them good in this way. And it's like, okay, and it can feel very like weird to go, oh, that's not good. But we have to be able to call it good when people are doing good things and have Jesus flowing out of them, even if they don't label themselves as Christians. That's hard.
Yeah, that's a whole nother
podcast.
I mean, created in the image of God, and all people are created in the image of God, and so we all have the imprint of the divine on us, and then that can manifest itself. And we can have a dualism of like, only if the whole world is bad, if we reject that idea, right, and the whole world is evil, only Christians can be good. That's obviously totally false, but it's difficult to wrestle with the implications of that.
It's totally false, but it's an idea that has a lot of traction, at least in certain amounts in the American Christian world.
Yeah.
And it's important that we don't buy into the only people who call themselves Christians can be good. Everything outside of that is evil, when God actually does call creation good.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I feel like, oh man, so much. I won't get into that.
But we're gonna get into this too about in just a few verses, really.
Fair.
About how high these standards are of what good actually is. I mean, Jesus, when the rich young ruler comes to him, he says, "Why do you call me good? There's no one good except God." I mean,
yeah,
and he is God in the flesh, so he's kind of like, he's really pushing on him.
I do think when I read this passage and I'm thinking about false prophets, I think, what's the appeal of a false prophet? And I think of what I'm attracted to with what I consume, what I listen to, what I pay attention to. I want stuff that flatters me, or soothes me, or entertains me. And if I'm flattered, entertained, and soothed, then I feel good.
Yeah.
And but the truth doesn't always flatter. It never flatters. It occasionally comforts and soothes when I need it, in the areas that I need it. And I think that part of what Jesus is talking about here is to be careful to not listen to what they say, because what they say might flatter or soothe or comfort you in some way. You have to look at how they're living.
Yeah.
And he could say this because he was Jesus, and they could look at how he was living and they could say, yeah, what he's saying is consistent with how he lives his life.
Yeah.
And so I can follow him.
I wonder if
it requires a little bit more work than just the sitting back and consuming.
Yeah. I'd love to add to that, because there's, was it entertain, comfort, and soothe, right? I mean, so those can look like, maybe categorizing in two different ways. Like, that can look by making things easier, right? Sometimes, though, it can make it look by setting the bar even higher, right? And it depending on who you connect with and what's your personality type. Maybe you accept a false doctrine that is like super restrictive, and like what it does is it puts up many more walls and all those sort of things, makes it impossible to walk with God. That I think the unifying thing behind a lot of false teaching is that it streamlines things, right? Like the truth is challenging, and wrestling with the truth like confronts my assumptions, it confronts my world, it confronts how I act, like all that stuff. And a false teaching allows parts of me that are not in line with God's reality to stay the way they are.
Yeah,
Because I can
exactly.
can smooth the edges a little bit, right?
It's giving you the false sense of you're in control still somehow. Like I don't really have
or I don't need to
make
give
God
something
God.
up, right? I don't need to get from like, and the reason why I say it can make things harder, like for me, one of the things I don't need to give up the fact that I am capable of accomplishing my own like salvation, right? I am capable of having that level of control, right? Like I need to actually give that up
Yeah.
in like a profound way. And so the false teachings that I can be
Self-sufficient.
or suspect to, right, are the ones that basically proclaim that self-sufficiency in some way.
Yeah.
So I think
And giving that up hurts.
It does.
yeah,
Right.
whatever the false reality is, like everyone's got a slightly different version, but
Yeah.
it's tough. And so so the soothing word you said, right? That's like so key, I think, to realize like, oh, this is like really great to hear. Like I love this. It's like,
Well, you used a word that made me go, and that was streamlined.
Yeah.
Because you when you said like it streamlines everything, it makes it simple, it makes it easy, it makes it quick, and like there's nothing in the text that says anything is quick. It doesn't say like, I think, and again, we have a baseline expectation that everything should be fast and quick and like microwave, fast food, all that, but
Efficient.
efficient. But whenever we look through the text, nothing was efficient. It took decades for people to be molded. It wasn't overnight, and so
Oftentimes it's the suffering.
Yeah,
brings
and
about
and it's like you can't be who God wants you to be, who God's calling you to be in this sermon, without going through the process of getting there. And that process is long. It's the narrow road.
yeah.
It's hard. It's suffering, and you can't get to where you need to get to without actually walking through it. And I think Tim did a really good job pointing that out, that false prophets tend to streamline. Yeah, you don't have to go through all the suffering. You don't have to go through all the stink to get to the good. You can just be the good. Well, it's like, no, God goes, no, I'm going to take you through the stink.
Yeah.
And you're going to be good at the end.
Van, I was thinking of Ananiah when you were bringing up this, something you said about soothing made me think, I wonder if that's what he, when he gets up and, hey, everything's going to be okay. Thus says the Lord. And Jeremiah's like, no, he doesn't.
Right.
He's like, I love it.
Yeah.
If God was saying that. Is
That's what
section?
false prophets
That'd be great,
do.
but
they
no.
say peace, peace when there is no peace.
Yeah.
And then they live like that.
Right.
And they live and they tell you everything's okay, and they don't follow what Torah says.
And for a while, it might feel good, but oh man, this is why you really have to pay attention.
That's the hard part with fruit, is that fruit can sometimes take decades
Yep.
Right.
to show itself.
That's right.
And so, I mean,
That's the next question, which we'll probably have to get to next
Okay.
pod.
All right. So thank you very much, guys. This has been fun. And we got through a couple questions here about how the way could be hard, the broad path could be hard and easy. And we're starting to dive in now on false prophets and fruit. And we'll pick that up again next time.